Welcome. You're safe here. The world outside can wait. This is the sleep menu. Before we go further, subscribe and comment down below from where you are watching this. High above the battlefield, before any spell has sparked or armor has clashed, before giants thunder forward or archers string their bows, the balloon hangs suspended, silent, steady. It drifts in a sky that holds its breath, a space between chaos and calm, between decision and consequence. The ropes creak faintly, stretched taut by time and repetition. The basket doesn't sway, not yet. Only the fire that keeps it aloft flickers, not from instability, but from awareness, as if even the flame knows it's waiting for something. There is no view from this height, only a pale ocean of sky, stretching endlessly in every direction. No markers, no borders, no banners waving in wind. Only clouds, shapeless and slow, and the hum of altitude. The earth is too far to make out clearly, but the balloon doesn't need to see the ground to know what lies below. It can feel the tension rising like steam, climbing invisible ladders of warm air, waves of readiness, of movement, of will. The scent of spells being summoned, of gold being poured into structures, of footsteps finding formation. The sky carries it all upward, soft and steady. But the balloon doesn't watch the details. It remembers the essence. Not the names of kingdoms or commanders, not the flags or the fight calls. It remembers sensation. The first time the ropes tightened with heat below, the way the seams of its metal core expanded with fire, the gentle shock of lift, the air catching beneath it like a second thought becoming real. It remembers when it was told to carry and when it was told to fall, and it remembers that no fall is ever without meaning. Far below, the world marches into order. Battalions align with precision, siege engines groan into place, mages draw symbols in the air that glow, then vanish. Arrows rest on strings that hum with potential. It's a storm waiting for its thunder. But up here, the sky does not acknowledge it. The sky moves slower. Time in this altitude has its own logic. It coils and uncoils in gentle loops. It doesn't count seconds. It counts heartbeats, breaths, silence. Beneath the balloon, nestled deep within its structure, rests the payload, a bomb, patient and soundless, yet absolutely present. It doesn't tick, it doesn't glow, it simply is. A silent agreement made long ago. A promise in the form of weight. It's not about fury or vengeance, it's about design, about completion, about the moment something becomes exactly what it was meant to be. The clouds slip past like dreams half remembered, some thin and wispy, others thick and dense, all indifferent to the presence of what drifts among them. The ropes vibrate ever so slightly, and the wind traces along the worn grain of the basket, pulling over the seams, through the joints. The wind doesn't care about battle. The wind doesn't choose sides. It only moves forward, always. Inside the balloon's frame, woven from metal, wood, fire, and memory, there is no tension. Only a still, enduring readiness. It isn't nervous. It isn't bracing for impact. It is becoming. It is aligning. The fire breathes steady now, no longer tentative. It pulses in rhythm with the rising awareness of the moment. A moment not here yet, but approaching. The balloon does not resist it. It does not race toward it either. It accepts, like mountains accept snow, like oceans accept storms, like all things do when the time comes not to act, but to fulfill. There is no horn, no shout, no signal loud enough to announce it. But the balloon feels it. The shift. A pull in the air, slight but sure, like the world below has finally drawn a breath and is ready to exhale. The ropes tighten in a different way now. The fire stirs, not brighter, but deeper, as if it's responding to a silent command. The moment has arrived, and it doesn't need to be named. The descent begins. It's slow at first, deliberate. The basket dips with grace, not like something falling, but like something being released. The balloon doesn't drop. It yields. It leans into gravity the way a leaf leans into wind, not out of surrender, but because it knows the way. The clouds part like curtains as it passes through, each layer of sky peeling back to reveal the earth below. The battlefield is no longer a blur. It's a canvas. Shapes take form. Walls, towers, moving shadows that are not yet enemies, just figures in motion. The balloon sees them all, but focuses on none. The path is already chosen, not by the crew, not even by the target, but by design, a straight line to purpose. The air grows louder the lower it gets. Sounds that were once just whispers become texture. Steel clashing, orders shouted, the cry of dragons circling above, the crackle of spells breaking against shields. And still the balloon doesn't speed. It maintains its tempo, calm and unshaken, descending with the certainty of something fulfilling its one true function. Inside, the bomb remains silent, but its silence is not stillness. It's waiting, watching. It knows the distance. It knows the weight. It knows the exact breath left before it becomes something else entirely. Arrows rise from below, their paths erratic and hopeful. They arc through the air, trailing behind them the desperate wish of interruption. Some strike the wood, some pierce fabric, but the balloon does not veer. It absorbs each hit with indifference, because nothing launched in fear can alter what has already decided its course. Closer now. The target is clear. The heat from the fire below meets the fire inside the balloon, and for a moment they recognize each other, not as enemies, but as parts of the same ritual. One gives, the other takes, and between them is impact. But the balloon does not rage, it does not hate, it does not scream. It simply exists in this final descent, holding within it the weight of inevitability. And just before the release, just before the moment when fire will meet, stone and sky will become noise, the silence after impact is not empty. It is saturated, thick with the weight of everything that just transpired. Smoke winds its way upward, not in haste, but in solemn procession, curling in thick plumes that trace the air like ancient script. A slow dance of ash and memory rises into a sky that does not shift, does not waver, as though acknowledging the moment without interruption. The earth now wears a wound, deep and deliberate. At the heart of the strike lies a crater, its rim scorched black, its center a cavity of heat and broken stone. This mark does not cry out. It does not demand attention, but it lingers, and in its quiet persistence it commands respect. The balloon is no longer in the sky, but it is not lost, not to time, not to meaning. Its remnants, twisted beams of scorched metal, tatters of once proud fabric, are scattered across the crater floor like ceremonial offerings. Each piece tells part of the story. The ropes, now slack, lay curled in irregular spirals, as if finally exhaling the tension they had carried since liftoff. The fire is gone, but its warmth has not entirely left. It hums faintly in the scorched air, in the dust, in the aftermath. The battlefield, vast, brutal, unrelenting, holds still, just for a beat. A rare and precious pause, stretched thin across the soundscape of war. Soldiers mid-charge slow their pace. Arrows, drawn and ready, hesitate. Even dragons in their sweeping arcs overhead shift subtly, unsure whether to land or linger. There is no space for mourning here, not truly. But even in the chaos of conflict, there is always space for stillness. And that stillness arrives now, not with words, but with presence. The bomb did not stray. It struck with precision, its purpose fulfilled. The silence that trails behind its fall is not born of fear or confusion. It is reverence, a recognition that something final has happened, something irreversible. Ash moves through the air in lazy spirals, catching glints of light filtering through the haze like fleeting stars. Somewhere not far off, a structure groans and collapses. No violence, no theatrics, just the sound of something ending. The dust rises in lazy plumes. Rubble settles. But the center, the point of impact, remains oddly untouched by motion, a frozen core of conclusion. No voices rise to break the moment, no cries of victory or despair, only the collective breath held between combatants, between allies and enemies alike, all of them aware, even if only briefly, that something true passed through here. Not a hero, not a monster, just a certainty made real. Soon, the noise will return, the clamor of swords and claws and magic. It always does. But before that, just before, the world waits. Because the sky released something it could not hold, and the ground accepted it without resistance. The battlefield does not stay quiet. Stillness was a grace, not a promise. And now, like breath returning to a body, movement stirs. The clash of metal resumes. The thrum of magic pulses back into the veins of the ground. The war continues. It must. But something has shifted. Small, maybe unseen, but undeniable. And above it all, remnants drift. Tiny pieces of the balloon still fall, slow and spiraling, catching light like drifting feathers. Some burn before they land. Others settle into the cracks and grass. They do not explode. They do not threaten. They simply arrive. Fragments of something that once moved with purpose and fire, now surrendered to gravity and silence. One such fragment, a piece of blackened metal, no larger than a coin, lands near a foot soldier, paused behind a ruined wall. He does not flinch. He bends, picks it up, turns it in his hand. It's warm, smooth on one side, jagged on the other. It tells no story. It carries no message. And yet, he holds it like it matters, because in this moment maybe it does. He places it in his pocket. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Elsewhere on the field, where the ground still smokes and the crater yawns wide, a pair of healers move among the wounded. They step around scorched stone and fallen banners, hands glowing with the slow light of restoration. Neither of them speaks about the blast. But their silence is not ignorance. It is reverence. They've seen magic. They've seen war. But they've never seen peace fall from the sky like that. Even in destruction, it felt deliberate. In the skies, the dragons fly lower now. One of them circles where the balloon once floated. It lets out a low, rumbling sound, not a roar, not a cry, something else, a recognition, a marking of space, as if to say, this happened. Even the wind remembers. It moves differently around the site of impact, gentler, slower, almost careful, carrying the scent of ash and heat, but also of closure. It brushes across the faces of those nearby, and for a moment, their eyes narrow, not against the wind, but because of what they feel carried on it. Not grief, not relief, just awareness. Later, the battlefield will be cleared. The war will shift elsewhere. Maps will be redrawn, but this place will hold its silence a little longer, and when people pass it, they will lower their voices without thinking. When birds fly over it, their wings will tilt slightly, adjusting to something unseen. Elsewhere, far from the battlefield's center, beyond the smoke and the scorched earth, the sky is quiet again. The wind moves freely here, unburdened by fire or fear. A single feather from one of the circling dragons floats down, white and faintly glowing, untouched by the violence it once hovered over. It drifts past broken trees, past shallow streams, now muddied by conflict, until it comes to rest on a stretch of untouched grass. In this place, the war hasn't reached yet, or maybe it has passed through already and left nothing worth claiming. The ground here remembers older footsteps, the kind that carried builders, not breakers. You can still see outlines of foundations beneath the overgrowth, stone slabs split by time, not impact, a place that once held lives, not strategies. A young scout finds it. Her armor is scuffed, her expression unreadable. She doesn't look like she belongs here. But then again, neither does war. She kneels at what was once a doorway, fingers brushing moss from the stones. The grass beneath her palms is cool and soft. For the first time in days, she lets her shoulders fall, lets the quiet hold her. She reaches into her satchel and pulls out a scrap of something burned, canvas maybe, from the balloon. She doesn't know where it came from exactly. It landed near her while she was tending a wounded knight. She kept it, not as proof, not as evidence, just kept it. She places it on the ground and weighs it down with a small stone. Not a burial, not a monument, just a mark, a moment made solid. She doesn't speak. She doesn't pray. She just sits, the wind curling gently around her, the trees swaying in time. Birds return to the branches above. One calls out once, then falls silent. The kind of silence that doesn't empty the air, but fills it. And in that silence, she remembers what it looked like. The sky above the forest shifts, painted with soft orange and streaks of lavender from the setting sun. The light filters down between the trees, weaving its way through a tangled lattice of branches and foliage, catching on old leaves and worn bark, casting slow, dancing shadows across the mossy forest floor. Here, far from the clash of swords and the rise of smoke, the world is quiet, not in retreat, but in exhale. A breath taken after the weight of sound has finally lifted. The air carries no urgency, only stillness, a kind of silence that feels earned. Through this calm, a veteran knight walks alone. His armor is dented, the edges dulled not from neglect, but from countless battles fought and survived. Each step he takes is heavy, yet steady, not from exhaustion, but from deliberation, as if the forest itself pauses with each motion, watching and allowing. In his hand he carries a broken spearhead, the metal scorched along its edge, and its shaft long since gone. It is not a weapon anymore. It is a memory, hardened and silent. He doesn't glance at it often. He doesn't need to. Its weight is familiar. The knight pauses near an ancient tree, one whose massive trunk has split wide with age, yet still rises with strength. He rests his back against it, easing down until he is seated among the roots. The soil is damp, and the thick roots twist around him like the earth's embrace. He closes his eyes, not to rest, not to sleep, but to simply be. In this moment there is no danger, no duty, just breath and ground, and time slowing to match his heartbeat. He hears something land nearby, a soft, dull thud that draws his attention without urgency. When he looks, he sees a piece of darkened fabric resting gently on the ground. It's stiff with soot, fragile at the edges. He reaches for it and lifts it with care, unfolding what remains of a torn banner or perhaps a fragment of balloon cloth. The material is nearly weightless, and yet, as he holds it, it carries something far heavier than its threads: remembrance. He cradles it for a time, running his thumb along its frayed edge, the way someone might trace the ridges of a scar. He doesn't need to know exactly what it came from. He already does. This cloth was once part of something that defied gravity, something that rose not to escape, but to complete its purpose, something that chose where to fall and didn't resist the end. He rests it gently across his knee and gazes out past the trees, toward the horizon, where the light is slipping into deep indigo and stars begin to claim the sky. A rabbit crosses the clearing silently, pausing for a breath before continuing on. The breeze stirs the branches high above, the leaves rustling with a whisper that holds no threat. There is no fire chasing it, No cry of warning, only the soft noise of the forest reclaiming itself, and the night remains still, a steady presence in the quiet. He remembers the descent. He had witnessed it from afar, not close enough to be caught in the blast, but close enough to feel it. The balloon hadn't fallen like debris. It had descended like a decision. He remembers the sound of silence just before it struck, how the world around him hushed as if bowing to the inevitable. Even the explosion, when it came, was not thunderous. It was precise, contained, meaningful. Now, surrounded by trees and sky, and holding nothing but a scrap of cloth, he does not think about the battle's result. Not about strategy or losses or even survival. He thinks about the balloon, about what it meant to fall with such quiet certainty, about the grace of letting go, not as surrender, but as completion. The cloth in his hands is not a souvenir. It is a truth, embodied. He doesn't speak the word bravery. He doesn't reach for grand ideas like honor or sacrifice. He simply understands. Some moments don't ask for names. Some truths don't need explanation. He folds the fabric once, carefully, and places it in the small leather satchel slung at his side. Not to save it, but to carry it forward, part of the story now written into his steps. He places one hand against the bark of the ancient tree and whispers something into the grain. A wordless thanks, or perhaps a vow. The tree stands silent. It listens, and when he rises and walks away, the silence does not break. It stretches out beside him, step by step, not following, but accompanying. The wind changed direction just as he stepped into a deeper part of the forest, shifting gently across the moss-covered ground, curling between tree trunks and lifting the tiniest particles of ash from leaves that had long since forgotten fire. The night moved forward slowly, his figure brushing through the ferns and low-hanging branches like a memory in motion. The air smelled of wet bark and soil, but underneath it lingered the faintest echo of something scorched, old, distant, and hauntingly familiar. He paused for a moment, letting the quiet speak. There was something here, not a presence, not a danger, but a knowing, the kind of knowing that can't be taught, only felt. With one gloved hand he touched the nearest tree, fingers trailing across the rough bark. It was cold, damp with the breath of twilight. The forest seemed endless now, stretching in all directions, a maze not of confusion, but of calm. Somewhere to be lost, and not fear being found. He walked deeper still, past a low ridge where the roots of several trees intertwined like ancient hands, past a small pool reflecting the first stars appearing overhead. He knelt beside it, peered into the water. His reflection looked back without judgment, his eyes tired, but no longer heavy. The satchel at his side shifted as he adjusted his weight. He reached for it and opened the flap, revealing the folded piece of cloth he had picked up earlier. Slowly, he unfolded it again and laid it across his knees. It had darkened further with the setting sun, the threads catching the dim starlight. As he looked down at it, the silence of the forest leaned in, as if curious about what he held. He didn't speak to it. He didn't try to name it. He simply sat, allowing the quiet to deepen around him, allowing the moment to lengthen. He thought then not of the balloon itself, nor of the explosion, but of everything in between. The weightless drift, the anticipation before the drop, the pause before gravity accepted its claim. He imagined what it must have felt like to hover on that edge between sky and earth, purpose and execution, to know what you carried, to know why. He remained there for a long time, knees bent beside the pool, cloth in hand, surrounded by a stillness that did not press or expect. The stars thickened above, forming patterns he did not name, and still he did not move. In the distance, the faint call of an owl broke the silence. Not disruptive, just part of it all. Eventually, he stood. The cloth was folded again, slower this time, and placed gently back in the satchel. He felt no urgency to leave the forest, but he also knew his time here had passed. The path ahead was not marked, but it was waiting. He turned from the pool and walked on, each step part of something larger. Not a quest, not a burden, but a continuation. And though the forest closed behind him with every step, it did not feel like it was closing him out. Night settled in layers, not all at once, but in soft waves, first dimming the sky, then lowering itself onto the tops of trees, and finally sinking to the forest floor, where each leaf became a shadow of itself. The night moved slowly now, not because he was weary, but because the quiet asked for it. He felt the hush of the world around him, as if even the wind didn't want to disturb what was happening. Above him, stars multiplied, spilling across the sky in patterns that had nothing to do with war or memory, just existence. He reached a clearing where the forest gave way to an open hill. The grass bent low under the weight of dew and moonlight. There was a single stone in the center, half buried, marked not by name, but by use. The kind of stone others had leaned against, sat on, breathed near. A place that remembered presence more than identity. The knight approached it and sat without ceremony, setting his satchel down beside him. He removed the folded cloth once more, now creased and worn, yet still holding the shape of what it had once been. As he held it in his hands, he felt the warmth of his own body transfer into the fabric. It didn't come alive. It didn't glow, but it responded. It softened. He thought again of the balloon, not as a machine of war, but as something that had known exactly what it was meant to do and had done it without asking for praise. Not out of rage, not out of glory, but out of trust in its design, in its moment, in its ending. The stars above seemed brighter now. The sky pulsed with a kind of presence, as if the universe leaned in for a moment, not to interfere, but to witness. The knight let the fabric rest in his lap and looked upward. He didn't wish. He didn't pray. He simply acknowledged that the fire once carried overhead had fallen, that something had been completed, and that what remained wasn't absence but transformation. He pulled his journal from the satchel, a small leather-bound book he hadn't opened in days. Its pages were frayed, edges curled from weather and use. He flipped to the last empty page and began to write. Not about strategy, not about loss, but about presence. He described the balloon as more than weapon, as choice, as movement with meaning. He wrote of purpose and the strange calm that came when it had nowhere left to go but down. The fall, not as failure, but as fulfillment. When he finished, he closed the journal and placed it beside him. He folded the cloth again, this time not tightly, but loosely, allowing it to breathe. Then he leaned back on the stone, arms resting across his knees, eyes toward the sky. The grass rustled softly around him, like whispers from below. The wind moved again, gentle, like a friend placing a hand on your shoulder without needing to speak. By morning, the forest was a different place. Mist rose from the damp ground in swirling columns, weaving between tree trunks and curling over stones like breath made visible. The night stood early, before the sun broke fully through the horizon, while the world still felt like it was halfway between sleep and waking. He gathered his things in silence, the journal, the cloth, the satchel, and took one last look at the stone before continuing on. His boots pressed into the dew-soaked grass, leaving dark footprints behind him that faded slowly as the moisture lifted. Birds had begun to call from the canopy, cautious at first, as if testing whether the quiet still held. The knight moved without haste, his path guided more by instinct than memory. He did not know where he was going. That was no longer the point. What mattered now was the movement, not the destination. The forest gradually thinned as he walked, the trees spaced wider apart, the underbrush becoming sparse. Eventually, the land opened into a wide plain that stretched far beyond the eye's reach. The sky here was pale gold, the clouds long and low, the kind that made you feel like you were walking beneath a ceiling of light. It was a new kind of silence, one not born of shelter, but of space. A silence that did not hold you in, but let you expand inside it. He stepped into the open field and paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the satchel against his side, the journal pressing against his hip. The cloth remained inside, folded and still. It had become something else now. Not a relic, not a burden, a piece of truth, a piece of something that once flew and fell, and in falling became more than anyone expected. In the middle of the field stood a tree, alone, weathered, and leaning slightly, but alive. Its branches reached unevenly toward the sky, leaves rustling in the early breeze. The knight walked toward it, drawn by no logic, only the soft call of stillness. When he arrived, he placed a hand on its bark. It was warm from the early sun. He leaned against it, not with fatigue, but with calm. The tree did not move. It simply accepted. He stayed there for a long time, watching the wind push through the grass like waves on a low sea. He didn't open the journal. He didn't unfold the cloth. He didn't speak. He simply breathed. Because some moments are not meant to be marked. Some are meant to be lived. And in those moments, it isn't what you carry that defines you. It's how gently you choose to hold it. The plain stretched on, wide and wild, untamed except by time. The knight stood beneath the solitary tree a little longer, watching as light shifted across the horizon in slow, sweeping gradients. He could hear nothing but the wind, and the wind said only one thing: keep moving. So he did. He stepped away from the tree, leaving behind no trace but a single pressed patch of grass. The ground beneath his feet turned from soft earth to compacted soil, interrupted now and then by stones sunken deep and moss-covered. He followed no trail. There was no path to find. His direction was chosen not by compass, but by quiet. Wherever the world seemed to speak less, he walked toward it. Wherever the sky seemed wider, he drifted. Eventually, he came to a stretch of land where the earth dipped into a natural hollow, and at its base sat a structure. Old, forgotten, partially swallowed by time. It looked like it had once been a watchpost. Now, it was barely more than 2 walls and a broken arch. The stone was gray and green with age, and vines coiled up from the ground like patient fingers. The knight approached it slowly, his breath steady, his gaze soft. He stepped inside. There was no roof. The sun poured down through the missing ceiling, painting the floor in gold and shadow. He removed his satchel and sat against the tallest remaining wall. It felt safe here, not because it protected him, but because it didn't try to. It was a place that had given all it could, and now simply remained. The journal came out again. He opened it with the care of someone unfolding a memory. The pages crackled softly. He did not write immediately. First, he sat. He looked. He listened. Then, slowly, he began to write. Not about war, not about victory or loss. He wrote about ruins, about structures that once stood proud and tall and still had value even after they'd fallen. He wrote that purpose does not vanish when form breaks, that being used and worn is not the same as being forgotten. When the writing was done, he closed the book and placed it beside him. From the satchel, he pulled the cloth, still folded, still marked by its past. He laid it on the ground next to him. This time, he didn't look at it as a relic. He looked at it as a reminder, a tether to something greater than orders or outcomes, a quiet testament to intention. He rested there until the sun reached its peak, shadows retreating to the base of the broken stone. Then he stood, collected the cloth, the journal, the satchel. Before leaving, he ran his hand along the wall, not to remember it, to thank it. The afternoon stretched ahead like an open road with no end in sight. The sky had lost its early gold and now wore a soft, even blue, cloudless, vast, and unbroken. The night moved through it all with the quiet pace of someone who no longer measured time in hours, but in footsteps. His shadow followed him across low hills and through dry grass, elongated, steady, as if it, too, had made peace with simply going forward. He found a stream just past the next rise, its waters thin but clear, winding between pebbled banks with the patience of old rivers. The sound of it trickling over stone was gentle, but constant. He crouched down and cupped the water in both hands, letting it spill through his fingers before finally taking a drink. It was cold and clean and grounding in a way nothing else had been all day. As he stood again, he looked upstream. The water came from somewhere he'd never see, but it didn't matter. It had reached him. That was enough. Nearby, the land flattened out again, bordered by clusters of low trees whose branches bent under their own age. The night wandered among them, not seeking shelter, but companionship. The way the branches creaked overhead in the wind felt like an old conversation, slow and knowing. He moved until he found a wide stump and sat down, setting his satchel in his lap. The cloth was still there, folded, resting beside the journal like it always had. He didn't open either of them yet. Instead, he looked around. This wasn't a sacred place, but it was calm, untouched by the urgency of war or the weight of stories. Just space, just trees and earth and sky. And in that space, he felt himself settle. His shoulders dropped, his breath evened out. There was no need to remember or record in this moment. It was enough just to be present in it. But eventually, his hand found the journal. He opened it again, turning past the pages already filled with thoughts of flame and descent and purpose. He came to a fresh page, and slowly he began to write about peace, not as something passive, but as something found, as something earned not through battle, but through walking long enough to see the world without armor. He wrote about simplicity, the sound of water, the sway of trees, the feel of stone beneath worn boots. When he finished, he rested the journal on his thigh and ran his fingers over the cover. Then he took out the cloth again. It looked different in this light, less like wreckage, more like a thread in a much larger tapestry. Not loud, not broken, just essential. He folded it again, this time with more care than before, and placed it gently back in the satchel. Then he stood. The shadows had begun to stretch again. The wind picked up and moved through the trees, not whispering, not calling, just moving. By the time the sun began its descent behind the hills, the night had crossed into a meadow he'd never seen before. It opened gradually, like the land had been waiting for someone to find it. Golden grasses bent in the wind, tall and soft, waving like a quiet greeting. Wildflowers peeked out in patches, defiant and bright, untouched by war or footsteps. The meadow was alive, not with noise or movement, but with presence. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed, and that was enough. He slowed as he entered, letting the soft ground guide his steps. The horizon here felt wider than anywhere else he had been. The sky overhead was now streaked with soft orange and pale lavender, a slow collapse into evening. He looked up and saw no birds, no smoke, no signals of the world he had left behind. Just open sky and the silence that followed it. At the far end of the field, near a crooked fence swallowed by time and ivy, there stood an old bench, weathered, cracked, but intact. The knight walked to it and sat down, letting his pack rest beside him. For a while, He didn't move. He didn't even think. He simply listened. The wind through the grass, the hush of twilight, the faint rustle of life beneath the surface. The land here was at peace. He could feel it in the way the shadows softened, and the air no longer held weight. He reached for the journal again. It opened easily, the pages worn to his touch. He flipped through his own handwriting, pages filled with moments of dissent, reflection, and quiet realization. These were not records of events, but of feeling, of truths revealed slowly, like water smoothing stone. He found a new page, blank and waiting, and he began to write again. This time, he wrote about light, about the way it changes the land when it fades, about the things we notice only when we stop long enough to see them. The flight of a balloon, the shadow it casts, the stillness it leaves behind. He wrote about how presence doesn't always mean action. Sometimes it just means staying long enough to become part of the place you're in. After he finished, he placed the journal on the bench and pulled out the folded cloth one more time. He unfolded it slowly, gently, laying it across his lap. The fabric caught the last light of day, glowing faintly. It no longer looked like something torn from war. It looked like something remembered, something that had held fire once, and now held stillness. The night didn't say anything. There was no need. The land around him said everything he couldn't. He sat there until the first stars appeared, small and tentative, blinking into the night, one by one. When the air cooled and the grass darkened, he folded the cloth and returned it to the satchel. Then he stood and faced the horizon. One more time. There was no map for where he was going, but there didn't need to be. He had already found what he was meant to carry. And it would carry him too. The next day arrived quietly. No trumpet of light, no blazing sun, just a gradual brightening that rolled over the landscape like a soft tide. The night rose before the sun had fully claimed the sky. He packed slowly, deliberately, giving each motion its own moment. There was no rush. The meadow had offered rest, and now it offered farewell. He nodded once to the old bench before turning his back to it, stepping into the golden light of morning. He followed the edge of the fence, the wood brittle with age and softened by moss. The path curved toward the edge of a grove where the trees began again, tall and leaning, their branches interwoven like hands holding a secret. The night entered, and the light changed. It flickered through the canopy in long shafts, striping the forest floor in patterns that moved with the wind. He stepped carefully, not out of caution, but respect. The woods were older here, quieter. They felt like memory. Soon, he reached a clearing, and in its center stood a stone monument, covered in ivy and cracked across its base. It bore no names, no emblems, just a single carved line still visible through the moss. We rose, we fell, and still we meant to rise again. The knight stood before it, his hands at his sides. He didn't touch the stone. He only looked, reading the words again and again. They weren't about triumph. They weren't about loss. They were about trying, about meaning. He removed the journal and opened it to a blank page. He sat on a low, flat rock and began to write. This time, he wrote about legacy, not the kind carved in statues or written into songs, but the kind carried in footsteps. He wrote about fire and descent, and how even in breaking, something could become whole. He wrote that not all burdens are heavy. Some are light because they belong exactly where they are. When the words stopped coming, he closed the book and placed it gently back into his pack. Then he reached for the cloth. Unfolded now, it looked almost ordinary. No edges scorched, no markings bold, but it was not ordinary. It had once been part of a fall, and in that fall, it had found its purpose. He looked at it for a long time, then folded it once more and held it against his chest. He stood and approached the monument. Carefully, he tucked the folded cloth into a small crevice at the base of the stone, behind the ivy, where it wouldn't be seen but would remain, not left behind. Given. He stepped back. The clearing held its breath. Then the wind moved through the leaves, gentle and sure. He turned without a word and walked away. Each step firm, grounded, not toward an ending, not toward a new beginning, just forward. Because some journeys aren't about finding the road, they're about becoming it. The forest shifted behind him as he moved farther into the open. The clearing gave way to tall grass and rolling hills, and the trees faded into distant outlines. The wind carried a new scent now, less of pine and earth, more of sun-warmed soil and blooming wildflowers. The knight inhaled slowly, letting the change settle in his chest. He was walking through a land that didn't know war, where the sky felt closer and the earth softer beneath his boots. Ahead, nestled at the base of a low hill, stood a wooden archway, almost hidden by vines. It looked ancient, maybe forgotten, yet still upright. It was the kind of structure that seemed like it had always been there, not because it was grand, but because it had been needed. The knight approached it and passed beneath without hesitation. On the other side, a narrow stone path wound through a field of lavender, the blossoms swaying in the breeze. He followed the path, his steps slow and steady, savoring the scent and color that danced all around him. Bees moved lazily from bloom to bloom, undisturbed by his presence. This place wasn't sacred in the way temples are, but it was sacred in its peace. There were no signs, no names, no symbols, only the feeling that something good had once happened here, and maybe still was. At the path's end, he found a bench carved from stone, half covered in moss. He sat without speaking, without unpacking his things. He simply existed there, in a silence so complete it didn't feel empty. It felt full of memory, of potential, of quiet truths that didn't need to be spoken. The wind brushed his face like a familiar hand. He eventually pulled out the journal, opened to a fresh page, and began to write. This time, the words came without effort. He wrote about softness, not as weakness, but as strength. He wrote that peace is not the absence of fire, but the presence of understanding. That some things, like fabric carried down through flame, become more than what they started as, not in spite of what they've endured, but because of it. He paused, then reached for the cloth. It wasn't in his satchel anymore. It was back in the clearing at the base of the monument. A realization settled over him, not of loss, but of continuation. It was no longer his to carry. It had found its place, and so had he. The knight leaned back on the stone bench, eyes lifting to the sky. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows that painted the lavender field in gold and violet. Birds wheeled overhead, their wings cutting across the light like brushstrokes. He didn't stand. Not yet. The moment didn't ask for movement. It asked for presence. And he gave it. Because some endings don't need closure. They only need to be witnessed and remembered, and quietly lived through until they are no longer endings at all. As the evening deepened, the knight finally stood from the bench. His joints moved slowly, not with pain, but with the rhythm of rest well taken. The lavender field, behind him, shimmered in the last light of day. A sea of violet, gently waving goodbye. He adjusted the straps on his pack and turned toward the west, where the horizon still held a sliver of amber light. His footsteps were soft against the stone path, each one quiet and sure. The path didn't lead anywhere marked. It tapered into open land, where the grass grew taller and the sky seemed to press lower, closer. He walked without questioning direction because the need to arrive somewhere had long faded. Now it was enough to move, to remain in motion, to stay part of the unfolding world. As the last rays of sunlight gave way to twilight, he found himself near a shallow pond. The water was still, reflecting the growing stars above like scattered gems. Frogs croaked in the distance, low and steady, their chorus blending with the soft rustle of grass in the breeze. He approached the water's edge and crouched there, watching his reflection ripple and return. Time didn't press forward here. It wandered. He unpacked slowly. The journal rested in his lap, the spine worn from use, the pages heavy with the weight of words. He flipped through them, revisiting thoughts that had once arrived in silence and stayed like companions. Each line was not just memory, but transformation. A map, not of place, but of heart. He wrote again. He wrote about stillness, not as pause, but as a kind of motion only the soul feels, about what it means to witness something fall and to carry its memory not as burden but as honor. He described how even flame leaves behind warmth, how endings sometimes open space instead of closing it. When the writing was done, he rested the journal beside him. He didn't reach for the cloth. It wasn't needed here. What needed holding was already held. The stars thickened above him, their light soft but sure. The wind curled around him like a story still being told. He lay back in the grass, hands behind his head, eyes open to the sky. It was not the sky of battlefields or fire. It was wide and waiting, like it trusted him to rest beneath it. And he did. Not as a soldier, not as a witness, just as a man. Sleep came slow, not because he resisted, but because he no longer ran from the day. And when his eyes finally closed, the night didn't swallow him. It held him. Because sometimes peace isn't something you reach. Sometimes it's something that reaches you. Dawn crept over the land with gentleness, spreading a soft gold across the hills and waking the world without demand. The night stirred slowly beneath the open sky, the dew on the grass soaking into the edges of his cloak. He sat up, not with haste but with care, letting the morning settle into his limbs before he moved. The pond beside him was still, untouched since the night before, its glassy surface now reflecting the first light of day. He packed his things again, methodical and quiet, brushing the grass from his cloak and wiping the pages of the journal where moisture had gathered. Nothing was lost, only made more real by the touch of the earth. With everything in place, he stood and looked out across the plain. The path ahead, though faint, curved gently toward a rising ridge. It called to him, not loudly, but with a presence he could feel in his chest. He walked toward it. As he climbed, the wind returned. It played with the hem of his cloak and whispered through the grass, a companion more than a guide. When he reached the top, he saw the valley below, wide and alive with morning light. Trees scattered like old thoughts. A river snaked through the middle, its shimmer catching the sun. Villages dotted the far edge, smoke curling from chimneys in soft gray spirals. Life continued, unaware of him, unshaped by his journey. And yet, he felt a part of it all. He sat on the edge of the ridge and opened the journal one more time. The blank page waited, calm and willing. He wrote about arrival, not as conclusion, but as recognition. He wrote that some distances are measured not by miles, but by moments when you understand yourself differently. He wrote about the balloon, not as a weapon, not even as a symbol, but as a turning point. The moment fire gave way to meaning, he paused and looked out at the valley again. Children would be waking. Water drawn from wells. Bread sliced and shared. There would be no talk of balloons or nights or cloth touched by flame. And that, he realized, was the greatest proof that peace had taken root. He didn't need to go down into the valley. Not today. Not tomorrow. It was enough to know it was there. He closed the journal and stood, the light now fully upon him. The ridge behind him, the valley before him, and all around. The quiet kind of certainty that only comes when nothing more needs to be said. He took a breath, deep and full, and then he walked, not to arrive, but to continue, because some journeys never really end. They just carry you into the kind of silence that finally feels like home. The night followed the ridgeline for a while, letting the slope guide him without interference. The wind had settled into a calm, steady rhythm, brushing across his face and cloak like an old friend walking beside him. The sun was rising higher now, casting long golden rays across the lowlands and painting the treetops with light. He took in the view with quiet reverence, not trying to hold on to it, but allowing it to pass through him as part of the journey. He eventually came upon a small grove nestled against the ridge, its trees low and thick with leaves, their trunks curved as if shaped by the wind itself. He stepped inside, the shadows wrapping around him like a pause between thoughts. The temperature dipped slightly under the canopy, the scent of moss and bark stronger here. Birds rustled in the branches overhead, their movements soft, their presence a reminder that, even in silence, life continued. At the heart of the grove stood a weathered statue. Time had worn away its features, leaving only the suggestion of a figure cloaked in stone. No inscription remained, no name, only a sense of dignity that lingered despite erosion. The knight approached it, sensing the weight of stories forgotten yet not lost. He rested a hand against its side, the stone cool beneath his palm. He set down his pack and pulled out the journal. The pages opened easily, as if they too had been waiting for this place. He began to write, his hand steady. He wrote about forgotten things, about the courage it takes to live a quiet life, about the sacredness of spaces that ask nothing of you. He wrote that not all memories need to be preserved in full. Some are meant to dissolve, leaving behind only feeling. When he finished, he placed the journal on a nearby rock and removed the last item from his satchel, a smooth stone he had picked up days ago, small and plain. He placed it at the statue's base, among the moss and leaves, a gesture, not of tribute, but of participation, a way to say, I was here too. He lingered in the grove, leaning against a tree, letting the quiet reach deeper into him. No longer was he searching for the next place, or the next thought. Now, it was enough to simply be. The statue, the grove, the wind, and the worn path behind him, each had played its part, and so had he. As midday approached, light filtered down in thicker beams. The knight gathered his belongings, took one last look at the weathered figure, and stepped out from beneath the trees. The world met him with warmth. The road ahead curved once more, and with nothing left to prove, he followed it. Not with urgency, not with purpose, but with peace in his steps and space in his heart for everything still to come. The knight walked for hours without counting the distance, letting the rhythm of his footsteps guide him through the landscape as if it were a familiar melody. The world had opened up again, wide and golden beneath the afternoon sun. Fields stretched outward in every direction, broken only by scattered trees and the occasional stone wall crumbling gently into the earth. There was a stillness in the air, but it wasn't empty. It felt like the land itself was holding its breath, listening. Eventually, he came upon an old windmill standing lonesome near the edge of a shallow rise. Its sails no longer turned, weathered and splintered, but the structure remained solid. He approached slowly, stepping over the threshold into the shade of the worn doorway. Inside, dust floated in shafts of light, and the scent of old grain lingered faintly, mixed with wood and time. He stood in silence for a moment, allowing the stillness to wrap around him like a familiar blanket. He climbed the creaking steps to the second floor, where the floorboards were warped but strong enough to hold him. There, in a corner, sat an old bench and a narrow window that framed the fields beyond. He set his pack down and took a seat, his eyes tracing the horizon. The sky was pale blue, streaked with thin clouds, and the world outside looked untouched, not preserved, but quietly ongoing. He reached for his journal, the motion now as natural as breathing. The pages fell open, welcoming. He wrote about places like this, quiet, steady places where time moved differently, where purpose wasn't shouted but whispered, where rest didn't mean stopping, but aligning. He wrote that peace doesn't always arrive as a reward. Sometimes it waits patiently in the places we're brave enough to slow down and find. When he closed the journal, he let it rest on his knees and stared out through the window again. Birds moved across the fields, swooping low and rising in arcs that seemed both playful and purposeful. They needed no audience, no meaning. Their flight was enough. He leaned back against the wall, letting the late-day sun warm his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt not just the absence of noise, but the presence of calm. It filled the room. It filled him. He sat that way for a long time until the shadows inside lengthened, and the golden hue of the sky turned soft and rose-colored. He packed his things once more, climbed down, and stepped back into the evening air. The windmill stood behind him, like a silent witness. He didn't look back, not because he had forgotten it, but because it had given him what it was meant to. He followed the path as it sloped gently downward, the land darkening around him, with the approach of night. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. Because some days aren't marked by what you do, but by how gently you move through them, and how deeply you let them stay. The night had settled over the land with a hush so complete, it felt like even time had chosen to rest. The sky stretched wide and endless, a tapestry of deep blues and inky blacks, scattered with stars that appeared one by one, deliberate and patient. Each star blinked into life as though it had been waiting for just the right moment to shine. They didn't blaze. They shimmered with quiet resolve. Beneath them, the night moved at an unhurried pace, his boots pressing into the damp earth, the soft crackle of fallen leaves cushioning each step. The cool air wrapped around him gently, and though he was alone, he didn't feel isolated. Instead, he felt seen, as though the stars had been watching his journey unfold all along. His path led him gradually into a valley, nestled and hidden, where the earth dipped softly between two old ridges shaped by centuries. The valley was calm, cocooned by shadow and slope, its hush deeper than the silence of open plains. At its center stood the skeletal remains of a chapel, long surrendered to time and weather. The roof had caved in years ago, letting in the moonlight like water through a broken bowl. Vines curled up the walls like forgotten prayers, and nature had taken back what it once yielded. But the stone walls endured, weathered, but upright, and the doorway remained, a simple arch, open and unassuming, offering not grandeur, but invitation. He stepped through it, and the air shifted at once, cooler, quieter, tinged with the subtle perfume of damp wood and herbs growing stubbornly through cracks in the stone floor. The moonlight poured freely through the open roof, casting dappled patterns across the interior, silver-blue reflections that danced with every stirring breeze. It wasn't grand, it wasn't preserved, but it was alive in its own way. One corner still bore moss creeping up the wall, where perhaps an altar had once stood. No inscriptions remained, no stained glass, and yet the space felt meaningful. It didn't echo with memory. It resonated with presence, as though simply existing was its purpose. He placed his satchel down carefully and settled himself against a firm section of wall. The ache in his limbs had become a constant companion. Not pain, just the echo of movement, a reminder of the miles behind him. His body was tired, yes, but it was the kind of tired that meant something. A well-earned stillness. The chapel wrapped around him like a shelter made of hush and shadow. Outside, the stream whispered to the stones, and the wind hummed gently through broken walls. He drew out his journal and opened it with familiar ease. His pen moved slowly at first, then steadily, finding rhythm in the silence. Tonight's entry was about faith, not the kind preached or formalized, not bound in doctrine or ritual. It was about quiet faith, the kind that lives in the still moments, in the spaces untouched by fanfare. He wrote of places that fall apart but still protect, of forgotten structures that offer peace simply by remaining. He wrote that not all sacredness is preserved in gold or carved in marble. Sometimes sacredness is a place that does not demand anything from you, but still offers everything. The words spilled out over the pages, more than he expected. When he stopped, it wasn't because he had nothing left to say. It was because the page felt full. He set the journal aside and let his gaze drift upward, through the roofless chapel and into the deep night sky. No clouds passed. No stars fell. The heavens held their shape with infinite patience. The stillness here wasn't empty. It was full of trust. He didn't need a reason to be here. Didn't need a destination beyond this moment. He leaned back and let himself slide gently down until he was lying flat on the stone floor, arms folded behind his head. The stone was cool against his spine. The silence didn't press on him. It supported him. And the stars didn't guide him. They witnessed him. Sleep came without ceremony. It unfolded around him slowly, wrapping itself through his limbs like roots finding home in soil. It came without command, like a friend returning unannounced. And just before his eyelids fell completely, he breathed a thought into the world. Not a request, not a declaration, just truth. The morning after arrived without fanfare or declaration. There was no sudden break in the clouds, no radiant burst of color across the sky. Instead, it came slowly, subtly, a quiet shift from the deep ink of night to the tender gray of early dawn. The horizon stretched outward like a blank canvas, brushed with the lightest hue of blue. The stars, once bold and watching, had faded into silence, leaving behind only the hush of morning. Inside the ruined chapel, the night stirred. His breath curled in soft clouds before him, visible in the cool, still air. For long moments he remained motionless on the cold stone floor, feeling the weight of the silence press down, not with force, but with comfort. The stone beneath him had not warmed, but its solidity had been a kind of anchor through the night. He lay there, grounded, as the light gently spread across the open roof above, outlining the crumbling walls in pale silver. Eventually he rose, slow but steady. Every joint felt the memory of the road, but none cried out in protest. His body moved like a story remembered. He looked once more around the chapel, where time had softened the hard edges. Moss clung to the lower walls, vines traced their way along the fractures, and the emptiness above let in both light and sky. The place was unchanged, but he was not the same man who had stepped into it the night before. He moved with care as he gathered his things. He folded his blanket, brushed leaves from his cloak, and slid his journal back into its place in his satchel. He paused at the archway before leaving, casting one last glance upward at the sky, now more blue than gray. It was a new day, one he hadn't asked for but had come all the same, and he felt prepared to meet it. The climb out of the valley was gentle, winding between slopes that had watched over him during the night. The chapel, once visible behind him, slipped from sight with each step, like a memory settling into its rightful place. There was no grief in the parting, only acknowledgement. He carried it with him now, not as burden, but as foundation. The land ahead began to stretch wider, welcoming him with open fields and patches of quiet woods. A low wind drifted across the terrain, steady and full of voice, though it spoke in no language he could name. He walked until he found a rocky overlook. It wasn't high, but it offered a full view of the plains to the north, the hills to the south, and the winding river that cut a silver path through it all. He sat there, lowering his pack beside him, and pulled out the journal once again. The pages opened easily beneath his fingers. The ink from the night before had dried into permanence. This time, his writing was deliberate. He wrote about return, not to a place, but to a state of being. He wrote about how rest doesn't change the world, but it changes how we carry the world within us. He reflected on the stillness he had found, and how it had reset the shape of his thoughts. He wrote that some moments are not grand or loud, but they restore the things we lose, piece by piece. The sense of direction, the willingness to walk, the courage to hope, without needing answers. His entry wasn't long, but it felt full, complete in its brevity. He closed the journal, let it rest on his knees, and looked out at the unfolding land. The breeze carried warmth now. A bird soared across the field below, its wings silent in motion. The world was moving, not rushing, and so was he. He stood once more, brushing dust from his cloak. The pack felt no lighter, but he felt stronger beneath it. He turned toward the path, undefined but inviting, and took a step, then another. He realized he wasn't walking to anything specific. There was no great battle ahead, no monument waiting to be found. There was only the act of walking, present, intentional, alive. He understood now that continuation isn't an act of repetition, it is a decision to remain open. By mid-morning, the path had carried him farther than he expected, not necessarily in distance, but in the depth of what he felt along the way. The landscape had widened with grace, spilling open in every direction beneath a cloudless sky now bathed in a pale golden hue. The light shimmered on the grasses that danced rhythmically in the breeze, and above him, birds soared in slow spirals that seemed to ignore time altogether. The knight walked without urgency. His boots pressed gently into the soft blend of soil and scattered stones, and though his thoughts drifted, they no longer sought anything. The quiet he carried within him did not ask to be answered anymore. It asked only to be allowed. Eventually, the fields began to narrow, leading him toward a gently rising ridge. Crooked wooden fences lined the slope, some barely standing, wrapped in the vines of blooming wildflowers. At the ridge's summit, a solitary tree waited, tall and wide, its branches a canopy of silver-green leaves that shimmered as they caught the sunlight. The tree looked like it had always been there, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever wandered close enough to rest. The shade it cast wasn't deep, but it was enough. The air underneath felt different, cooler, softer, like the kind of silence that listens back. Beneath the branches stood a flat, sun-warmed stone, worn smooth from years of sitting. Nearby, arranged in a quiet circle, were stones of all shapes and sizes, clearly placed by hand. Some were carved with runes or names. Others had been left untouched. The knight knew what this place was. It wasn't a graveyard. It was a memory held in place, a circle of belonging. He sat down on the stone, not with ceremony, but with care. He let his legs stretch, his hands rest. He listened, to the branches swaying above, to the wind as it passed softly over the hill, to the silence between the two. It said nothing dramatic. It whispered, simply, that it had been here long before him and would remain long after. That was enough. He pulled his journal from the satchel beside him, flipping through pages worn from thought and time. When he reached a blank one, he paused. Then he wrote. Not quickly, but with intent. He wrote of memory. Not just memory as names and dates, but as something older, deeper. Memory that lives in certain places, woven into the way a tree leans or the feel of stone warmed by sun. He wrote about how not all remembering is a burden, that sometimes memory becomes a shared act, held by the world when we cannot hold it all ourselves. He continued, describing how rest isn't always about stopping motion. Sometimes it's about being received. It's about finding a moment or a space where you don't need to do anything more than exist. He let the words find him slowly, as if the tree itself was lending him its wisdom. When he finished, he closed the journal and set it gently on the stone beside him. He sat there a little longer, watching the wind move over the field below, watching light shift through the branches overhead. From this height, the path behind him had faded into a sea of tall grass. The path ahead remained unseen, but no less certain. He rose and approached the circle of stones. He didn't place anything down. He didn't need to. His presence had already joined them. Instead, he stood still and lowered his head. Just once, long enough to be part of the quiet. The tree gave no reply. The wind made no special note of his leaving. But something inside him felt grounded, as if his steps now pressed deeper into the earth. And so, he turned away from the ridge and walked forward, not because he had finished something, but because something else was beginning. Slowly, quietly, without promise or pressure. The trail beyond the ridge meandered into a wide, sloping plain, where wild grass rose to his knees and swayed with a persistent whisper that seemed to echo stories from long ago. The breeze that moved through it had rediscovered its voice, gentle, steady, full of wisdom earned over time. He welcomed it not as a stranger, but like an old companion returned. It nudged at his shoulders, a soft hand urging him onward with no urgency, no expectation. He followed willingly. There was no longer a need to push forward, nor a desire to remain still. Each step became a sentence in a quiet dialogue he had finally learned to understand. The plain, at first unbroken, slowly revealed its hidden marks. Low stone walls stretching across the fields, many of them collapsed and smothered in moss. Their shapes hinted at old stories. Boundaries once fiercely guarded, now surrendered to weather and time. He stepped over each one carefully, sensing the invisible weight of memories beneath his feet. With every crossing, it felt less like walking through land and more like wandering through layers of forgotten seasons. He couldn't help but wonder who had once drawn those lines, who had built those barriers believing they would last forever, and whether those people, too, had once paused here to listen to the same wind speaking now. Far ahead, emerging like a memory, stood a weathered barn, leaning gently into the horizon. Its roof had partly collapsed, exposing its frame like bones of something once strong and vital. The wood had faded to a silvery gray, sun-bleached and time softened. It looked abandoned, yet not forsaken. It stood not because it had to, but because it chose to remain. He approached with quiet reverence, noticing a bench tucked beneath the sagging awning, intact, dry, still welcoming in its own humble way. He lowered himself onto it, his body sighing into the seat as though it had found something it didn't know it was looking for. From the bench, the view stretched open, endless and calm. The plain rolled gently toward a slow-moving river, which shimmered like a blade of silver in the sunlight. Birds wheeled above in wide arcs, their calls mixed with the rustle of grass and the low hum of insects. It was a world in motion, but not in hurry. The knight let his eyes close, not to escape, but to feel. He became one with the silence, not to be forgotten, but to be fully present. When he opened them again, he reached for the journal in his satchel. The worn pages opened without resistance. He began to write, slowly, carefully, as if the words needed to be coaxed forward. He wrote about thresholds, not gates or barriers, but those quiet crossings we only notice in reflection. He described the unseen shifts that move us from one state of being to another, not through noise, but through gentle recognition. No ceremony, just a sense that something has shifted. He paused often between lines, letting his thoughts breathe. He didn't write to capture or prove. He wrote to understand, to give form to the feelings that had followed him across meadows, through valleys, and now here to this moment. He wrote about forgotten barns that still offer rest, about benches that don't question why you sit, about how strength sometimes means holding firm, and other times, simply staying. He filled several pages this time, not with urgency, but with clarity. When he finished, he let the journal sit open in his lap. The wind moved gently around him, sifting through the barn's broken planks. Light filtered in through the fractured roof, spreading across the floor in bright, shifting patterns. The bench creaked beneath him, not in protest, but as if joining in the rhythm of his breath. He stood slowly, not because he needed to leave, but because he had received what the place had to give. He turned to the barn, not to say goodbye, but to honor it. Then, with quiet resolve, he stepped once more into the tall grass, letting it brush against his legs as he walked. There was still no path marked in dirt or stone, only a direction his heart had begun to trust. A feeling in his chest that guided him more surely than any map. The wind had shifted again. It wasn't stronger, nor colder, but there was a new weight to it, a tone that resonated deeper, like the lowest string on a harp being touched for the first time in years. The night walked steadily now along the forest's edge, where ancient trees stood tall and close together, their trunks marked with the slow passage of time. Their bark was gnarled, split by seasons, and laced with moss that clung like old memories. The leaves overhead rustled gently, not in agitation but with a knowing calm, as if passing messages between themselves, too quiet for any hurried soul to understand. Only those who had learned to wait, to walk with intention, could hear their stories. Sunlight trickled through the thick canopy above, stretching into long golden bands that moved like whispers across the forest floor. It illuminated patches of soft earth, pine needles, and wildflowers that had sprouted where the light dared to touch. His steps were nearly silent, cushioned by the forest's natural carpet. The air was filled with scents layered upon one another. Earth, bark, old wood, and the faint sweetness of sap slowly dripping from wounded trees. As he ventured deeper, the forest thickened, but never grew menacing. Instead, it welcomed him with its weight and hush. There was no sense of being closed in. Rather, it felt like stepping into a sacred chamber that had long awaited his arrival. The trees seemed to recognize him, not with sentience, but with familiarity. Here, time no longer moved in hours or minutes. It stretched into something looser, more fluid. Each inhale and exhale felt vast, as though the air itself was breathing alongside him. Before long, he emerged into a clearing, a quiet, natural circle tucked gently into the forest's heart. The trees encircling it leaned ever so slightly inward, not as barriers, but as guardians, keeping the space safe from the rest of the world. In the center stood a single stone pedestal, weathered and smooth, its top polished not by hands, but by time and wind. It bore no carvings, no names, no symbols. And yet, the moment he saw it, he knew it was important. Sacred somehow, in its simplicity. He approached slowly, each step careful and deliberate. Sitting cross-legged beside it, he let the silence take root around him. There was no urgency, no need to reach for his journal. Not yet. He simply sat and listened. The wind wound through the clearing in long, curving breaths. Birds called occasionally, their voices distant, but distinct, as if announcing their presence only when truly necessary. Above him, the canopy swayed in slow rhythm, patterns of light and shadow shifting like thoughts just beyond conscious reach. When he finally did open the journal, he did so with both hands, treating it less like a tool and more like a companion. The pages fell open without resistance. He wrote slowly, carefully. He wrote about presence, not as an idea, but as an act. About how some places become sacred, not because of history, but because of how they allow you to fully arrive. He described the difference between solitude and loneliness, how the forest had made it clear that being alone could be a deep, nourishing thing, a return to something unspoken. He paused often, letting the silence between the words stretch longer than the lines themselves. It wasn't hesitation. It was reverence. Every sentence felt like it belonged not just to him, but to the space around him. He wrote about the pedestal, not as a monument, but as a symbol of what we build when we don't need to be seen. Structures meant not for legacy, but for grounding, for remembrance, without explanation. He wondered who else had found this place. Whether years or decades ago, another traveler had sat exactly where he sat, felt the same calm, and left without taking anything but peace. He imagined them, not in detail, but in feeling. A silent kinship formed across time. When the entry was finished, he didn't close the journal. He left it open, letting the pages rest on his lap. A breeze stirred, brushing his cheek, lifting a few strands of hair. Above him, the trees responded, their branches giving a low, rustling reply. It wasn't applause, but it was acknowledgement. It was enough. He stood slowly, knees stiff but grateful. From his satchel he drew a small stone, smooth, oval, and unmarked. He placed it gently on the pedestal, not to be remembered, not to be counted, just to mark that he had been here, that he had shared this space, even briefly. Then, with one last look at the clearing, he stepped back into the forest. The trees shifted around him, not closing, but adjusting, as if making room for his next steps.